and welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andrew, and you're joining us for part 2 of our look at the Charleville musket and its US-made derivatives and their place in American history. If you're only just tuning in and you missed part 1, go ahead and click the link right up here to go watch that episode on our sister site, Revolutionary Gazette, and then come back and join us. In the previous episode, we looked at the French Charleville musket, where it came from, how it was created, and then the small changes made through the various models and its service during the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and into the Napoleonic Wars, and how that impacted America and how that gave the seed for the American arms industry of the early 19th century. Today we're going to continue the story and follow the last versions of this musket up through the Model 1842 and chronicle their service up through and including the American Civil War. The Model 1812 US musket was officially approved for service in December 1812. The prototype design included a great deal of innovation for a lot from the French 1777 Charleville, as well as other innovations into it. The Model 1812 was meant to use interchangeable parts in its construction, as the Army sought to further standardize weapons production. However, it fell short of that goal. The weapon itself was criticized for being ill-balanced and having too heavy of a forward balance, which meant that it would tire out a soldier as he was trying to aim the weapon. There were some innovations that were retained from the original prototypes, like a recess in the cheek of the stock in order to make it more comfortable for a soldier to aim, but a lot of the other innovations were put on the shelf. The 1812 was both produced at Springfield Armory only, it was not produced at Harper's Ferry, and by US contractors, each making approximately 20,000 weapons.
The Model 1812 was produced at Springfield Armory between April 1815 and January 1818. It was shorter than previous muskets at 57¼ inch long. The 42-inch barrel has an octagonal breech with a bayonet lug on top of the barrel. The barrel bands have short, stud-type band retaining springs. Later versions have long retaining springs. The buttstock comb has a cheek recess.
But the Model 1812 did was begin to introduce a lot of the new ideas and set the stage for it, and set the stage for the next weapon, the one that would define the end of the flintlock era in American history, the Model 1816 musket. The Model 1816 US musket was one of the most widely proliferated versions of the French-inspired Charleville in US service. It was adopted for service in August 1816, but due to the time to retool, didn't actually begin production at Springfield until 1818 and Harper's Ferry until 1819. The weapon incorporated many of the innovations that had been put in place with the 1777 Charleville and had been originally in the prototypes for the 1812 US musket. The changes included changing the shape of the lock, changing the shape of the cock, changes to the ramrod and barrel bands, ultimately making it easier to produce, more reliable, stronger, taking advantage of an increase in metallurgy. This weapon was produced at Springfield, Harper's Ferry, and by US contractors, and even the ones produced at the armories had many of their parts subcontracted out to local manufacturers for barrels, stocks, and various other parts of it. There are 3 major subvariants of the 1860. The Type 1 is originally produced, and what's called sometimes either the 1822 or more generally the Type 2 1816, which is different because it had a brown barrel to it. There's a third version of the weapon that entered service in 1832, which is known as either the Model 1832 or more commonly, and what we'll use here, the Model 1816 Type 3 musket. This reverted back to using Armory Bright.
Production of the Model 1816 musket Type 1 began at Springfield Armory in January 1818 and at Harper's Ferry in 1819. It remained in production until late 1822 or early 1823. The weapon is 57½ inches long with a 42-inch barrel. The bayonet lug is on top of the barrel. The stock has a low comb with no cheek recess. The lock plate is flat forward with a beveled edge and convex to the rear of the cock. It arcs to a point at the rear. The cock is convex with a heart-shaped throat. The tang rear is straight. The pan and hammer are inclined forward. The weapon has a short trigger plate. The Model 1816 Type II was produced over a 10-year period ending in 1832. Most metal parts were browned to prevent corrosion. Some later production Type I muskets also had browned metalware.
And the idea with browning the barrel instead of leaving it armory bright is it made it more resilient against corrosion and therefore meant less work for the soldier in the field to care for it.
The trigger guard is simplified from the Type I, with the short trigger plate replaced and the lower swivel moved to the trigger guard itself. This reduced parts and eased production. The Model 1816 musket Type III remained in production until 1840 at Springfield and 1844 at Harper's Ferry. It marked a return to the bright metalwork of the Type I musket. The lower sling swivel was reinforced and the ramrod is thicker than on previous versions of the musket. The cock clearance groove in the stock above the lock plate was discontinued. Beginning in the 1840s, Model 1816s were converted to percussion. Some 400,000 were converted prior to the Civil War. Percussion alterations were achieved in one of three manners: cone and barrel, drum bolster, and the chamber breech alteration, sometimes using the Maynard tape priming system. Though there are many examples of the 1816 Type I and earlier weapons converted to percussion, the government generally focused on converting the Model 1816 Type II and IIIs.
Over the over 25-year production life of the weapon, there were many minor changes incorporated into it over time that appear between Type I, II, and III, but none of them in themselves are particularly significant. What is interesting about the 1816, though, is the longevity of its service. The 1816 stayed in service for about 40 years, including up through the early parts of the Civil War. While it wasn't designed to be made into a percussion weapon easily, Type II and Type III weapons were converted starting in the 1840s, and by the time of the Civil War, several 100,000 had been converted to percussion use. These weapons saw service in this configuration during the early part of the Civil War, equipping troops of both sides, including the 2nd Wisconsin, the Iron Brigade, the Pennsylvania Bucktails, and many other troops. Because as more modern weapons had entered into state and federal arsenals, these had been relegated to 2nd and 3rd class status. And during the rush to the colors in 1861, states on both sides emptied out their arsenals of these kinds of weapons and put them in the hands of their troops. The weapon in its original flint configuration saw service starting during the Seminole and Black Hawk War. It was the main U.S. weapon during the Mexican War. And finally, still in its flint configuration, saw limited service during the early part of the Civil War. During the 1862 Kentucky campaigns, during the battles of Middlebrook and Mill Springs, Confederate troops are still using Model 1816s in flint. And at the Battle of Mill Springs, that played an important part in the battle because of the unreliability of their flint mechanism during the rain. With a total production of over 700,000 between Springfield, Harper's Ferry, and contractors, the Model 1816 is the most widely produced U.S. variant of the Charleville musket. While it's not the last of the flintlocks made, it was the last one designed without really thinking about percussion down the road. It was the last one that was finished by hand. It was the last one that was flint, that was meant to stay a flint musket. It had to be improvised to be a percussion musket. The last flint musket in U.S. production was the Model 1840. It was adopted in 1835, but production did not start until 1840. With production in the 1840, tolerances were tightened from 0.025 inches to 0.01 inches. This meant that the Model 1840 was the first fully interchangeable U.S. musket produced.
It was only produced at Springfield Armory from 1840 until 1844, and by contractors Daniel Knipes of Philadelphia and Lemuel Pomeroy of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The 42-inch barrel is armory bright with a bayonet lug on the bottom of the barrel. The side plate was reshaped from previous muskets. The lock is of heavier construction and the lock plate had a broad rear finial. The pan is horizontally mounted and the hammer spring has a large curve in the front.
When the 1840 was adopted, the Army was trying to decide whether it was worth adopting a percussion system or whether keeping flint. And so they purposely designed this musket in order to be easily converted to percussion. In practice, the Model 1840 never actually saw the field as a flintlock weapon. When it was produced, its weapons went directly into storage, and then in the mid-1840s, they began being converted to percussion. The Model 1840 was a transition weapon. It was the last hurrah of the flintlock, but also the first with an eye towards the new percussion system that would define the Civil War era and set the stage for the last American-made derivative of the French Charleville, the Model 1842. The Model 1842 musket is the last US-made derivative of the Charleville musket. We made about 275,000 muskets during its production run, ending in 1855. It was the last musket in .69 caliber. It was the last one to be designed as a smoothbore for US infantry service. And it saw service through the American Civil War. There's plenty of famous units on both sides that carried this weapon. As a matter of fact, in the Irish Brigade, Francis Mahar, their first brigadier general, purposely wanted this weapon because of its large caliber and its stopping power.
The Model 1842 musket was produced from 1844 until 1856. It is 57 3/4 inches long with a 42-inch barrel in armory bright. The bayonet lug is on the bottom of the barrel. The lock plate is flat with a beveled edge. The cock is a swan neck and the nipple has no vent screw.
This weapon was fully interchangeable. As a matter of fact, in the 1850s, 9,000 weapons were flooded in Harper's Ferry Arsenal. And after each part was cleaned, there was no attempt to reassemble the muskets as they were. The parts were just put into buckets and reassembled, proving that all 9,000 were fully interchangeable. Prior to the American Civil War, approximately 25,000 Model 1842s were converted to rifled muskets. When the musket had been adopted, it had purposely been adopted with a thicker barrel in order to allow part of it to be removed for rifling in case the Army decided to do that down the road. It was still in .69 caliber and was adopted to use the Burton bullet, the American-made adaptation of the Minet ball. These weapons went on to service as well during the American Civil War, mostly in the Union armies. The Model 1842 was the last in the long line of French and American muskets stretching all the way back to the Charleville, adopted right after the War of Spanish Succession. It was a weapon that was really outclassed by the technology that was coming on around it. It served alongside weapons like the Spencer and the Henry, the Sharps rifle. These weapons represented the next era of technology. They were rifled, they were smaller caliber, higher velocity. They were weapons that that were breech loading or weapons that carried multiple rounds. They were weapons that used brass cartridges, and they represent the technological innovations of the 19th century, whereas the 1842 represent the last hurrah of the 18th century, the last hurrah of this weapon that had been innovated and stretched and incrementally changed to the very last part that it could sustain. There was nothing wrong with the Model 1842, but it was a weapon out of its age in that it had been changed to the very limit of what the musket itself could withstand. And it's not surprising that at the end of the American Civil War, the Charleville and its derivatives left US service, and they were replaced by the modern weapons that had been started produced during the American Civil War. Over the course of these two episodes, we've looked at the history and the legacy of the French-made Charleville and its American-made derivatives through service in multiple armies and multiple wars. This weapon was instrumental in winning American independence. It was instrumental in the service of the early republic, whether fighting the War of 1812 to preserve our independence or pushing the westward boundaries of our country. And finally, it saw service in the American Civil War, that cataclysm in the 19th century, where the Charleville and its derivatives finally outlived their usefulness. I hope you come away with this episode with a better appreciation of the Charleville and the American-made derivatives, their roles and their service through the early republic, and a better understanding of the weapons themselves. For Revolutionary Gazette and Civil War Digital Digest, I'm Andrew, and we'll catch you next time.